Two. My name is Kelly Hanna. I am extraordinarily grateful to serve on the board of Friends of Great Salt Lake. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this village. We've got another exciting day. A couple of housekeeping notes. Before lunch, we will be awarding our Doyle Stevens scholarships, welcoming a couple of more folks to our village. So be here for that. We will have a film crew floating around today as well, shooting a 30th anniversary celebration for Friends of Great Salt Lake. So thank you, friends, for your good work over these years, 3 decades. And let's see, Bonnie Baxter just brought in some applications for the Great Salt Lake license plates from Senator Plum. So we have, I think, just a couple more dozen of those before those are underway, and those applications are up here in the check-in desk. And I think that's what I've got for this morning, so thank you for being here. Day 2, here we go. And lastly, I almost forgot, acknowledgement for our sponsors. Thank you. Without these folks and these organizations, we wouldn't have the capacity to be here together. And being here together with the funding of these sponsors is a powerful thing. Thanks.
Join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Don Paul.
Well, it's always nice to be among friends. Just quickly, when I was here yesterday, you haven't noticed when Representative Snyder was here, the Fowler Oak came dancing down the aisle and in an amorous way attempted to get a hug from him. How many of you recognize that he did not hug anyone? Get the hug. Well, I suspect that Representative Snyder knew quite a bit about Fowler Oaks and their polyamorous lifestyle. But today I'd like to tell you a story. I'd like to tell you a story about birds, brine shrimp, equal and unexpected opportunities. Okay, I'm going to figure out how I change this. So, we all have, on occasion, issues with things that happen in our lives, circumstances that are unexpected, and consequences. No, consequences are part of daily life. They can be positive, they can be neutral, they can be negative, I guess, in some ways. Today, the story that I'm going to tell has to do with some opportunities, some unexpected opportunities that are associated with consequences. So between 1990 and 1996, a major historic environmental court case and an expanding industry and opportunities associated with those two events, in some ways changed how we look at the Great Salt Lake, how we may manage it, and how we appreciate it. So the story needs a little bit of underpinning. There are lots of people involved with this story, four of which I think will come to bear kind of in the background, that I just quickly like to mention. Gail Sanders was the pioneer in commercial development of brine shrimp harvest on the lake. Dr. William Bailey was an ornithologist at the University of Utah that spent many decades studying bird life in the Great Salt Lake, more specifically, bird life on the islands of the Great Salt Lake. Dr. Doyle Stevens with USGS at the time in the University of Utah, back in the early 1970s, pulled all of the data that he could find together that had been printed relevant to what was understood about the macro and microbiology of the lake to inform the work that he was going to be doing. Gwen had a bent toward bringing research to the surface, and he wanted the public to know about this, and so as a researcher with the State Department Division of Lands, he put together these 2 volumes that you see here below him. In a way, he was kind of the predecessor of the Forum, where he wanted to bring the latest and greatest to the forefront. Well, I think perspective has something to do with the story here. Lake values change through time, and maybe as an illustration of this, if I can read this off my side, John Silver, who's the proprietor of the Silver Lands Beach, kind of a recreation site on the south end of the lake, said this: "The millions of flies we kill daily create a thick and heavy layered mass of rotting brine flies which run like a wide black band along the water's edge of our beaches, extending for miles east and west of our facility. Chemicals applied to beaches have been effective in destroying adult flies, but none had succeeded in eliminating or even materially reducing their nuisance. Today, we know that brine flies are a keystone species of the lake. So, as we move forward in the story, we'll see how that is important. The 1980s was a really interesting decade. It was probably it is the most dynamic decade of the last 4 decades. Especially when you look at in terms of how the lake changed in elevation through time during that period. As an example, in 1982, the lake elevation was about the same as when the pioneers came, 4,200 feet above sea level. But in 5 years, it increased elevation by over 11 feet. I mean, we're talking about from 1,500 square miles to 2,850 square miles in a 5-year period of time. What was interesting about this is all of the infrastructure associated with wetlands was underwater. The state dikes were managed and flooding at about 4,206 feet above sea level. So it was a really interesting place. It was a lake. The wetlands were part of a lake. And maybe really of interest is that the north arm became much more like the south arm in terms of salinities. Birds moved there during that period of time. Brine ship harvest activities moved there during that part of the time. So this is a setup kind of for what was to happen. So in 1997, the National Audubon Society and the Mono Lake Committee and others filed a lawsuit against the Department of Water and Power in Los Angeles because of their dewatering of 4 of the major tributaries that went into Mono Lake that affected ostensibly the public trust values of that system. Well, just to jump to the end, in 1983 the court case was held in favor of the public trust doctrine. But before that, the Department of Water and Power had an interest in seeing how the resources at Mono Lake compared to other sites within the Great Basin, and to see if any of those comparative values made a difference in how the court case would be seen. So, in this process, the Department of Water and Power contracted with Hub World Research Institute, which is a research branch that's been housed by tried to pursue. And asked them to see if they could look at other places that had resource values and how they compared to what was going on in Bone Lake. So, helped SeaWorld under contract with the Power Department, contacted the Division of Wildlife Resources and asked them if they would do some studies relevant to bird species that were associated with Mono Lake that may have occurred at the Great Salt Lake, which the agency decided they would do. And this is part of the unexpected opportunity that I'm talking about. How strange it is that we're asked to do a study relevant to a court case that has an environmental bearing, and yet we're going to have an opportunity to learn about the resources of our own lake. Maybe it would be important to recognize at this point that consider what was known about the Great Salt Lake up until this point in time. There's a lot of known about the wetlands. Islands have been studied. The extraction industries were well enforced in time. And many other things, but there was really not much known about the bird life that was using the lake proper and the resources that were associated with them up to that point in time. So, as a sidebar, this 100 years ago, in 1925, this was published. This article was published for the U.S. Department of Agriculture by Alexander Wetmore. Alexander Wetmore is best known in Utah for having studied duck disease and the Bear River marshes where he got his master's degree. But later on, he was asked to look at several shorebird species and how they may affect in terms of their food diets and agriculture in a positive or negative way. So 100 years ago, he collected phalaropes at Great Salt Lake. I'm suspecting it's Mono Lake. I didn't see that in the literature. And looked at their stomach contents and learned that brine flies were really an important part of the diet. 45 years now has passed from 1925 to 1980, and nothing else has been going on in Great Salt Lake understanding those species. Well, we took the task of looking at the information that was requested by LA Water and Power, and the results were amazing. So in 1982, we had the contract was from 1982 to 83, and in that period of time, we learned that phalarope, or the Great Salt Lake was a significant, important site for redneck phalarope, including when we were doing our survey work when phalaropes were mostly here during the peak time, there were over 600,000 birds between the two species. On the other hand, in the fall, we did some work with eared grebes using photo transects, and Boyd, later tomorrow, I believe, is going to be talking a little bit more about the process of how these surveys were conducted. But the bottom line here is we learned that there were over 1.5 million eared grebes in the fall of the Great Salt Lake. These are impressive numbers and important data as it relates to informing the Great Salt Lake. So, this unexpected opportunity launched shorebirds under the world screen as far as the Great Salt Lake's importance to them. So in 1992, the dedication of the lake, the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve site was put in place, including it as a hemispheric site, one of only two in North America at the time. I can't explain very clearly how important these kind of actions have been in terms of promoting the lake in terms of the hemispheric practice. On the other hand, we've learned that at that point in time, that the Great Salt Lake was one of two, Mono Lake being the other at the time, that hosted primarily the entire fall population of eared grebes. So that's the unexpected value of the consequence of being involved with that study. The second part of the story is, how much time do we have? About 15? Okay, thank you. Thank you. So then part of this story has to do with brine shrimp harvest. And it also has revealed some unexpected opportunities. So the harvest of brine shrimp started out very quietly in the beginning. Neil Sanders and his family and another associate started harvesting brine shrimp in the early 1950s, mostly adults. These would be used as an aquatic, saltwater aquatic food source. Then they started harvesting cysts at that time. And they were really the only ones in the lake. I mean, after they went out, wondered who's going to pull the truck out from being stopped. Wasn't anybody around to do that. In 1963, the state imposed a royalty tax on the industry, which was very small, basically one company at a time. But remember that one reason I brought up the importance of the dynamics of the 1980s is we went from this pretty average lake elevation to the highest lake elevation in history in a few years. And it was in that period of time that brine shrimp harvest industry started to simmer. Other companies started to come in. And by 1988, it was in the shrimp company involvement on the stove was boiling. So that in and of itself caught the Division of Wildlife Resources, who was responsible for the ecosystem, not put the ecosystem aside, at least for the invertebrates who are part of the lake. So it became really frenetic. I mean, it was big time, fast going. In fact, Gil Sanders said this in the news. The industry has grown at least tenfold over the past 5 years, estimated Gil Sanders, whose family pioneered the business 40 years ago. At that time, we were the only one harvesting brine shrimp on the lake. To add some additional information to this event, in 1986, the biomass harvest for that year, better? You hear me? Okay, I'll speak into it. The harvest during that period of time was about 300,000 pounds of raw biomass, which means they would collect off the lake or off the beach all of the things that had cysts in it, and so the weight pertains to the total biomass. But the interesting thing, by 1998, the biomass harvest exceeded 10 million pounds. So the harvest switched from being shoreline gathered cysts to open water. And the harvest companies in that period of time grew from 1 to 32. So it was really got to be a busy place. Well, some people refer to as a gold rush, and it really was, in a sense. I mean, you think about the Klondike gold rush, you had to stake your claim. That's the same thing brine shrimp companies had to do. They had to go out and put a buoy in or on a streak in order to identify it as their streak to harvest. While this was going on, all this stuff going on, the division was trying to figure out the best way to manage brine shrimp on the lake. It was an interesting time. You know, they were using all kinds of technology to do this. Aircraft for observation to lead with GPS boats to places on the lake. It was just going big time. In fact, I was, as a biologist at the time, I was doing a shorebird or waterbird survey, one to the other. And I looked out of the windows of the plane, and there was a plane out of every window. It was scary. So it was an interesting time. So the Division of Wildlife Research was caught between two conditions. An explosion, and what are we going to do about it? You know, how is this going to fit into our responsibility for brine shrimp in the lake? Well, in 1990s, the heat on the stove started to come down a little bit. As the harvest companies increased, they saw a need, and we saw a need for more conservation control and the sustainability of the resource became a concern. We already knew from the work that we had done and continued to do about Madeira grebes. Madeira grebes were an obligate brine shrimp forager. And that was that side of the coin of the ecosystem was really important to the Division of Wildlife Resources. So the industry actually petitioned to their credit, the division to start to look at more of regulated, controlled harvest. And they were starting to look at, become more sophisticated in how they were going to organize themselves. So moving forward in 1996, the Division of Wildlife Resources Board passed some regulations that improved or built upon the harvest requirements on the lake, and the number of companies ended up being 32, and an moratorium was put on the certificates of registration at 79, which is an operating document necessary, kind of like a fishing license, to fish the system. And what's important here to recognize is that these were annually renewed, these certificates of registration, and they were costly. They were $10,000 a piece, renewable annually. So with $790,000, that became the budget of what then was created at the same time, the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Project program, a program under the auspices of the Division of Wildlife Resources. So things started to fall in place. A program to start to manage the resource, better sense of regulation, and part of that decision was to develop a technical advisory group that would function under the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Project. So this was called TAG, and still is. This was truly a very cautious beginning. I mean, there were people that had many things at stake. The division had managing the ecosystem in a sustainable way at stake. The industry had their commodity needs at stake. And the people that came around the table invited at that time were literally holding their cards to their chest. And eventually, it was interesting that as they play a card, they noticed that the agency's card that they played on the data was the same cards. And they could see that there was the same kind of information coming together, and this was a time maybe to become more cooperative. So this is the unexpected part of this story as it relates to brine shrimp harvest. This is a microcosm story to things that you probably have happened in your lives across your work with the Great Salt Lake. But it's one, I think, that that adds a need to take a closer look at, because this technical advisory group program under the able assistance and help of the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Project is really stellar. The TAG members are comprised of scientists and ecologists, people interested in schools and consumer experiences, people that understood ecosystem principles. The goal of the ecosystem project and the goal that became part of TAG was a long-term ecosystem sustainability founded on science and the best management practices. And that seems to be the way it's working today. So some successes here. Probably one of the primary factors that have been a glue, a laminate to keeping TAG together and moving forward was the development of an adaptive brine shrimp harvest model. And you'll hear more about that from Gary Biologist, who really is the author of that model and who's the leader in the TAG group to move it forward. Excuse me. But it's interesting when you have specific goals, needs, and shared interests, how more effective an advisory group can be. Well, the other part that was made TAG really makes TAG effective is the consistent, cooperative, and coordinated research elements of what they do. So this little arrow takes you to Gary Biologist, who was an original member of the TAG team 20 some odd years ago and is still present. And I think I would just like to give a shout out to the Ecosystem Project and Gary's work. I think the industry as well would recognize that this has been a major moving force and making this a stellar program of understanding principles, putting them in place, and moving forward with question after question being examined. TAG has been productive for a long time. So there are a lot of successes that came through this process. Some of them are associated with TAG, some of them are not, but it's been money well spent. We're still one of the targets that Gary came up with early in the model, and its ground through time is the concept of leaving 21 cysts per liter in the lake to start the next year's population. That is held up very well in the model, and that's a success story in and of itself. There have been many students who have gotten their PhDs, master's degrees from this program, informing the model, informing the ecology needs and understandings of the Great Salt Lake. That includes not just these you see here that have been working on the lake. Gary's lab, first off at Utah State and then at Notre Dame, has produced a number of graduate students associated with the iterative lab work necessary to inform the model. So the advantage to what's been going on, thanks to Mother Nature, thanks to how we perceive and attempt to manage the resource, the companies have been very successful. And as you can see here, 13 consecutive years, they exceeded 20 million pounds of biomass harvested that is refined, where brine shrimp just become a food source for flatfish fisheries and crustacean type fisheries like shrimp that we eat on our tables around the world because of the unique nature of these eggs that are in diapods and can be rehydrated and fed to them. Well, I would just say this in conclusion, in terms of capturing unexpected opportunities. And that is that if an unexpected opportunity arises, give it some thought. Thank you. Any questions?
The light one. Oh, kind of working. Good morning. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your personal work that you've done on Great Salt.
My personal experience?
Yeah, your personal experiences and any work you've done with the wild.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you for asking the question. Well, it's been, the Great Salt Lake is, my feet have been salty all my life. I grew up in Utah. My bedroom window faced Antelope Island. I thought Antelope Island was the last bastion of wilderness in the world. So it was been a joy to be a biologist there. And I guess basically to see how things move through time. You know, you saw the photograph taken from a Peregrine Hack site tower to demonstrate how the lake came up in 1 year's time, flooded the road. I went through all of that, and it was just a wonderful experience, an interesting experience, sometimes a scary experience, to see what the lake can do. I think the bottom line for me is that the lake is in control, and we just have to pay attention to that. Hiya.
I just, well, I think there's many in this room, the older, that want to appreciate your shrubbery service. Don created a mass of volunteers to do shrubbery surveys around the lake, and it created a community that I don't see has been met again. And I just want to say thank you for all the work that you've done on the lake and the communities that you created and the forethought that you had to help us understand.
Thank you. Let me just conclude with one observation. I showed the slide of perspective, how brine flies are perceived on the beaches in the late 1950s and early 1960s. I was in my office at Antelope Island on a Friday afternoon, stepped out to check my cell phone. We didn't have cell phone coverage, very good cell phone coverage at the time. And I had a message from the Houston Space Center in Houston, Texas. And the bottom line was that they were wanting to know, somehow they got a hold of me, from the photographs that were being taken from space of the Great Salt Lake, why there was such a difference between the colors of the north arm and the south arm. So queries come in from all over the place, even out of space, about the Great Salt Lake. It is literally the international airport of Utah. Flights come in every day. They need a wet runway, and they are spectacular. Keeping the runways open is really our task, our job, and what we need to do. Thank you.
Good morning. What a pleasure to be here. I am joining you from Mona Lake at the conference today, and have thanks to so many people, Lynn, and all the organizers and all the presenters. It's just great to be with this group. I just learned things about the history of Mona Lake from Don Paul that I didn't know, even though I've been with Mona Lake Quinney for 30 years as the executive director there. So this is just a great, it's a learning opportunity. Mona Lake, of course, we're up there on the other side of the Great Basin with stories to tell, and I get the honor of sharing them with you today. So just a few words about the Mona Lake Committee, where I'm an executive director. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to the protection and restoration of Mona Lake and its tributary streams and surrounding lands. We also are pursuing education and science programs to share and enhance understanding of special resources and places. We were founded back in 1978, just a few years before that litigation that led to Los Angeles funding work at Great Salt Lake. And the committee has about 16,000 members across California and the Great Basin and the country supporting the work, people who all sort of share that vision of having a unique and inspiring and internationally significant resources of Mona Lake, having those people. So I've been attending the forum here for many forums, many years, and I'll just say it's really impressive to see how it's grown, how much interest there is, how much success there is in the work that's being done at Great Salt Lake. It's been fun to be able to be part of that and take ideas back home. Listening in yesterday, Great Salt Lake Commissioner Brine's remarks were really interesting. A number of points that were really familiar from Mona Lake. One that jumped out at me was highlighting how the cheapest and most effective solution for air quality problems in emissive lake bed is to put water back onto that emissive lake bed. Over on our side in the Eastern Sierra, you'd think that about $2 billion later, billion with a B later at Owens Lake, that this is how Los Angeles might approach the air quality challenges at Mona Lake. But you would not be correct in that approach, so you can say Los Angeles has some things to learn from the wisdom here in Utah about air quality management. Commissioner Steed also observed that plans can look great on paper, but the real key is implementation. I hardly agree with that. That is very much our experience at Mona Lake. We are 30 years into implementing the plan to protect Mona Lake. We've got a good plan, but restoring the lake to the protection level that is required, that it needs, is only halfway achieved. We're overdue on that schedule, and I'll be talking about that some today. The other thing that caught my attention yesterday was Emily Lewis talking about the Utah water law and all the successes in getting the paper done, getting those laws passed, getting the regulations in place. And maybe that's a perspective that Mona Lake can help with, where we have a lot of paper on the books at Mona Lake, and we are in that implementation phase. You really need to have that paper, but we can maybe send you a perspective from being decades out past the big decisions and the public trust doctrines and the water board decisions. How is it actually going on the ground? So let me share a little bit of Mona Lake background to get us started. I know many of you have visited. I've talked to you. Some of you maybe are going to see this for the first time about Mona Lake. That's great. Please come visit us. Here in Eastern California, of course, Mona Lake in a closed basin with all the water from the Sierra runoff here gathering in the Mona Basin. We are not as big as Great Salt Lake, although very proud of all the things happening at Mona Lake. So about 45,000 acres surface area. So what is that? Maybe Great Salt Lake's about 15 times the size of Mona Lake. But things happen at Mona Lake that don't happen here at Great Salt Lake. Tufa Towers being very photogenic and well known as one of those. This has to do with the lake's unusual water chemistry, salty, of course, but also Mona Lake has a pH of 10. There are a lot of carbonates in the water, connected to the unique geology of the area. And so when freshwater springs enter the lake, calcium carbonate precipitate forms, and then when the lake goes down, you can see these fossilized springs that are beautiful, interesting, and a bit of a reminder that they were once underwater. A familiar looking ecosystem probably, brine shrimp, alkali flies, critical habitat for all kinds of birds, California gulls here, California gulls running along the lakeshore, chasing those alkali flies, brine flies. We pretty much, in normal presentations in California, say, we've got the most California gulls, except for Great Salt Lake. Or the Wilson's Fowler population, you won't believe it. I mean, if you were at Great Salt Lake, it's a bigger, but we're used to that, it's okay. But between the two lakes, we're working on this, perspective of togetherness, right? Between the two, we know that these are some of the species that really rely on, collectively, Mono Lake and Great Salt Lake in their migrations and their rise in the Fowler's here in the South Peak area. Well over 1 million here grebes out on the lake in the fall migration. And of course, tributary streams coming out of the Sierra and bringing water to Mono Lake. Lots of habitats there as well for fish and really the riparian habitats, of course, and wildlife. And Mono Lake's a great place for recreation as well, very popular for hiking and getting down to the lake, enjoying Mono Lake, bird watching, photography. All the great things we all can do to enjoy these special places. Okay, and the history, well known by some, but always worth a look back. The city of Los Angeles has quite a history with the Eastern Sierra, with Mono Lake, even though we're 350 miles north of Los Angeles. You can see the headline from the LA paper back in the day, Titanic project to give the city a river. Well, this was the construction of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, and the city came to the Eastern Sierra and gathered up the water rights through land purchases and diverts water out of the Owens Valley and the Mono Basin for delivery to the city as part of its water supply. And it's a very legendary part of the growth of Los Angeles and the growth of California. And it was also done at a time when the impacts on the environment at our end of things really were not part of the calculation at all. Bit of a map showing just how far north we are at Mono Lake and here in the long hundreds of miles journey that the aqueduct follows to move water into Los Angeles. But we are part of an extended watershed now, and it's a system that's in place. The question is, how do we manage things to make sure that Mono Lake doesn't suffer the unfortunate fate of Owens Lake, which quickly went dry in the early part of the last century. Water diversions, water comes out of the streams, not out of Mono Lake, rather salty, so you have water. And LA taps the 4 of the 5 major tributaries to Mono Lake, Rush Creek, Woodland Creek, Parker, and Walker. They don't quite make it to Mill Creek, even though they have the water rights up there. And then the water, to get out with the water out of this closed basin, it leads through a 13-mile tunnel, which turns out to be something of its own water harvesting apparatus. And a lot of groundwater flows into that tunnel during transit and gathers another 5,000 acre feet or so of water a year. All right, so what happened to Mono Lake as the result of the capture of the inflowing streams? And it was the complete diversion of these streams for many decades, starting back in 1941. You guys know the story, right? I mean, Mono Lake went down, and it went down quickly because the substantial part of the inflow had been lost. So we went from a lake level of 6417, that's our surface elevation there, or a little bit higher elevation. We love hanging out with people who talk about numbers all the time. 6417, we made it down to 6382, the lake went down 45 vertical feet, lost half of its volume, of course doubled in salinity as a result, and was headed lower, really threatening the whole system with collapse. And that was, you can see some of the impacts here, just showing how the lake was receding and the towers. Land bridges emerged, and the lake leading out to some of the critical nesting islands where California gulls nest, allowing predators to walk out there. Grab the gulls, still in use today. air quality impacts, of course, from the exposed lake bed, dust storms. Owens Lake is famous for these. I know Phil Caduce here will be talking about this. Things have gotten better thanks to air quality regulations and work at Owens. So Mona Lake is often now the worst PM10 particulate air pollution source in the nation. Dubious on it. Streams were dried up. We lost the stream habitats, about 20 miles or so in total downstream diversions. And then I think it's important to highlight also impacts on the Mona Lake Kuzetica tribe, the indigenous people of the Mona Basin, whose cultural heritage is really centered on Mona Lake. And the decline in lake, the decline in the resources we think about represented a real decline in the ability of the tribe to carry on their traditions and look to the future. So there's kind of a famous, advocacy story at Mona Lake of a bunch of scientists / hippies rallying in the 1970s, doing some real science and seeing, I think, what people knew the lake was going down, but what were the consequences going to be? They really identified some of the salinity thresholds. We might have somebody from that group in the room today, maybe. Anyone out there? Yay, Dave Herbst. A group who did research and then said, you know what, what we found is so concerning and so significant, we need to do something about this. And that led to the forming of the Mona Lake Committee. Activities like this, where they're returning some water from Los Angeles to Mona Lake, shows a need. And then a lot of real significant precedents, and we could do a whole presentation about those, and I won't. But fish and game codes in California had not been implemented. They require that owners of dams like Los Angeles pass enough water downstream to keep fish in good conditions. When you look at Lee Running Creek here in the 1970s, I don't think you're finding fish in good condition down there. So this fish and stream habitat requirements came into play, as did the very important public trust decision at Mona Lake that Don was referencing, where the California Supreme Court wrote the public trust is an affirmation of the duty of the state to protect the people's common heritage of streams, lakes, marshlands, and tidelands. And they really gave the lake not priority over water rights and use in the city, but a seat at the table, something that needed to be balanced and thought about in how water is allocated. Along the way, this is our staff on a field trip a few years ago, standing in front of the Department of Water and Power in Los Angeles. We really looked for water solutions to this problem, and there really are quite a lot of them with water efficiency, water conservation, ways to manage this water so LA has what it needs and Mona Lake has what it needs. In the 1990s, we got to the State Water Board, and the State Water Board's in charge of water rights. They were charged with taking that public trust doctrine and incorporating it into the water rights of the city, and they established a long-term management level of 6392, 6392 feet above sea level as a management level for Mona Lake after extensive studies considering all the things that you might think they should. How about brine shrimp? How about wildlife? How about bird population? Recreation resources? Cost to the city to figure out how to survive with getting more water to the lake and so on to the city. And notably, the city of Los Angeles, that's the mayor at the time, Mayor Reardon, joined in with the committee and many other parties in accepting this decision and saying, enough controversy, enough lawyers, we're going to implement this. This is a balance that's going to work. So, I believe there's a theme here about how are we doing with our implementation, and I'm going to talk about that. But before getting there, I just want to highlight two things. The water board decision is represented as kind of shaded. Well, it happened here in 1994, and we're 30 years out now, so we're celebrating the 30th anniversary. And you can see how the lake has done since then. Not there. Not really looking like a trend line. We'll talk about that. But let's pause for a moment and say, but it's not off the screen and down there either. And if you run the hydrologic models, you find that without that action, without the advocacy work, Mona Lake would be so salty it would be an Owens Lake. It would be lost to us as an ecosystem. And so we celebrate that even as we try to figure out how to get implementation to really happen. So I had to throw in, after yesterday's talk about Endangered Species Act and phalaropes, I had to just throw in a point I thought might be a good context from Mother Lake. We heard Representative Snyder refer to the phalaropes in petition. I just want to show that the Mother Lake brine shrimp, which is its own unique species, different than the great saltwater, was petitioned and understudy for listing in the Endangered Species Act back in the day in 1988 or so. Why? Because the lake was going down, it was getting too salty to be a habitat of habitats. It's not listed today, and the reason is simple. It was being studied for that, and the State Water Board, the decision makers, the government officials looked at what do we need to do to protect Mona Lake and make sure everything works together. They identified a lake level that provided salinity levels that would assure long-term protection for brine shrimp, and then the Wildlife Service said, well, this is great, we don't have a crisis situation, we don't need to list them because we have a stable plan for long-term management. So I think the same thing could happen with phalaropes, and it's a good point that when we find solutions, lots of things get solved all at once. Another thing I wanted to mention in terms of what's happening in Mona Lake now is within the heading of tribal beneficial use. And so what's happening is this expansion of how we recognize water is being used. This came up yesterday too, how beneficial uses of waters are recognized. This is a really important one that's happening at Mona Lake. We have the classic roster of resources that we talk about, the migratory nesting birds, brine shrimp, ecosystem health, recreation, they're all important. But really for far too long, in the state of California, even the Conservation Community, Mona Lake Committee, have left the Mona Lake Kuzetica tribe, the indigenous people of the Mona Basin, off the list. And the state has been working to put ways in place to do better, to recognize tribes, tribal heritage, and the state's created a way to identify water quality management, water resource management, tribal beneficial uses. And probably many of you are familiar with this, Clean Water Act and all of that. You identify waterways and say, well, this one's good for recreation, this one's good for fishery, and this one's needed for industry, and you set water quality standards accordingly. In California now, we're able to identify waters that are important for tribal uses, tribal heritage, culture, subsistence, food gathering. And at Mona Lake, we are the first water body in the state that's going to receive this designation. This is Charlotte Lang, who's the chair of the Mona Lake Kuzetica tribe, talking at a hearing just a couple weeks ago that we were at. Really excited to work with the tribe on this. Somehow snuck in the back. So there you go. But we've got this large report from our Water Quality Agency, tremendous amount of oral history presentations from the tribe about these uses that will lead to the designation of Mona Lake and the tributary streams, and it's really giving the tribe and that piece of water management a seat at the table going forward. Some slides from the presentations by Janice, who's a tribal elder, which showed the history, but I think really importantly showed the current present day uses and engagement with the tribe and how what happens in Mona Lake is relevant to the future. Okay, I'm going to keep moving fast because there's too many exciting things. I don't want to run out of time. So, how are we doing? Well, we are, this is our poll showing us where Mona Lake should be. If it was at the management level, it would be at the top of that poll right now. But we're not. The Water Board expected that the lake would rise to that level in about 20 years. It gave specific amounts of water to Los Angeles. Where are we now? The lake's only halfway there, 30 years in, and LA's been able to divert more than expected because of that extended timeline. So what we're doing is a lot of thinking about what needs to happen next. The state board themselves recognize that maybe things wouldn't roll out as their hydrology modeling has expected, and so they have a provision for a hearing, and that's coming up. It's a slow process. I think I talked about it 2 years ago when I was here. So we are working on that. and making sure that we can make a case to revise the rules for how they manage Mono Lake diversions. These are the current rules, which I will not read to you, but the key highlight is that they're tied to lake levels. So certain amounts of water can be exported from the streams, diverted from the streams, and exported based on lake level. And it turns out this really does make a difference, even though some of those numbers may look small to you for those who used to create Salt Lake numbers. The green line here is showing how the lake would have performed since the water board decision without diversions, and the blue line showing how it actually has. And you can see that differences accumulate over time, and the lake would be much higher without diversions. So the question is, what kind of rules could you write? Since no diversions is not really the solution at the moment. And we're really focusing in on dynamic rules and how we could potentially implement those at Mono Lake. And I think it's a good idea and a good lesson from the implementation world for Great Salt Lake as well. And so the farther out we get from the water board decision 30 years ago, we realized what seemed like it was going to work perfectly at the time isn't quite following along. The goal is still the correct one to get the lake up to the management level. Why don't the rules that were written at the time adapt somehow and follow the lake as we make progress? And so when we get those wet years and the lake rises, why do the rules still refer to low, much lower lake levels? And the problem is it lets the lake rise, and then diversions can cause it to fall back down, sort of down the ladder to the bottom, and then we, oh my gosh, okay, wow, it's low, we got to start again and try to get the lake higher. And so we're exploring a dynamic set of rules. You can imagine rules that adapt, and once the lake rises, maybe the rules change with it. We're still pursuing the same goal, but the rules are helping get you there without having to restart an entire public process along the way, have a hearing, and all sorts of things. And go right past that, I'll just say there's a lot of monolith going on. We're calling on Los Angeles this year to forego increasing diversions at Mono Lake, following this concept on dynamic rules. If we had them, there probably wouldn't be an increase, but under the old rules, it's allowed since we had that wetland or lake rose. Probably right now today, there are meetings happening in downtown Los Angeles about this request, because the answer is supposed to come out by next Wednesday. So a lot of current pressure working with community groups and environmental groups in Los Angeles that we're excited about. And I'll just wrap up with some of the conclusions and lessons learned. Honoring the heritage of tribes and Native peoples is really important. That's something that's come together for us, and we're really excited to advance. When the lakes get low, Mono Lake, Great Salt Lake is the same, you really can't fix it in a year or two. You can be worried when you're there, but it's about planning ahead. And that's what we're really looking at. And of course, I know many of you are here at Great Salt Lake, but at the wet year, everybody relaxes. Seems like it's good. We know the dry years are coming. How do we plan to make sure that we have a plan in place, a management plan that's going to get us through the dry years, get the lake through the dry years? Things like the dynamic rules are an important part of that. Many of you have probably seen the Audubon article. Again, I just want to celebrate the collaboration and the partnerships that are really in evidence here. This was really exciting for us, talking about Great Salt Lake, Mono Lake, and Mar Chiquita in Argentina. Conference here, there's so many science things that are tying people together and tying these places together, year-green research, fallow ropes, brine flies. It's very exciting. And lastly, I'll just say, all this can lead to science and knowledge, but engagement and excitement. And we have a student exchange program that's come together this year between Mono Lake and Mar Chiquita in Argentina. Students there coming up just next month to Mono Lake, and we've been connecting virtually all through the winter, learning about the different places doing studies together. There's some good potential to expand that to include Great Salt Lake next year. These are the kind of things that happen as we all work together. Happy to take any questions if there's time, and I'll be here for the whole conference as well. We'll talk about Mono Lake.
Good morning. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Something that we've had a really hard time with here in Utah is getting tribal leaders as seated as people. I'm wondering what advice you have for that. We'll hopefully do that going forward.
Well, it's a challenge. That's a big lift. I would say that much credit goes to, in our case, to the Monolake Cruzetica tribe for organizing and being able to really express how they weren't at the table. And at the same time, I think in California, a lot of effort to, whether it's the state water agency or state government, to create those seats. And so that process I was talking about really is it's coming from both sides. Engagement, but tribes have always been trying to engage, but really treating the place.
Presentation, that was great. We still haven't set a healthy minimum base legally, right? For the lake, and do you have any advice or strategies on making that happen?
Great Salt Lake has a challenge that's different than ours. We have one huge water diverter, and so at Mono Lake, that legal requirement is written into the water rights of the city of Los Angeles, and so in some ways that's simpler. I know it's a challenge here, many diverters, many uses, many places, so that's something that gets figured out here. But I think it's important to still know, because you can do a lot of good work, and if you aren't getting the lake into that healthy zone, of course, you aren't getting to the final goal along the way. I think what the State Water Board of Mono Lake did that's useful even with many water right holders and diverters is connecting those rules to how the lake is used. And it's tempting to just sort of do the math and say, I think I got it all figured out. And, you get this much and you get this much and everything will be fine down at the lake. Why not connect it to, here's the lake. And maybe have those rules adapt with the health of the lake.
Well, thanks very much. I want to thank Lynn and her team for bringing me back. It's always great to be back at the Great Salt Lake and see the enthusiasm in the room and how much science is going on at the Great Salt Lake makes me quite envious. So we're just a little bit farther down on the flyway. Vigo Fowler will be back and fly from the Great Salt Lake through Mono Lake to the Salton Sea. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Salton Sea, some of the lessons learned and some of the applicability. So this image is a causeway that was recently constructed. It's the first project, in fact, the only project at the Salton Sea. I think some of the people here yesterday, Brine and others, were down there recently and saw this causeway. It's to pump Salton Sea water back into a habitat project. So I work for the Pacific Institute. We're a small nonprofit based out of the Bay Area, although actually only a few people work in the Bay Area. I'm out of Boulder, Colorado, on the other side of the Colorado River basin. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about here. Give a little background, a little bit of the origin story of the Salton Sea. Talk about some of the water rights and water and market transactions and how that has an impact, and how, particularly how the Salton Sea fits in the context of the Colorado River Basin and the long-term drought or aridification that's occurring in that basin, and how the Salton Sea is critical to help solve that problem. Talk a little bit about some of the plans and prospects at the Salton Sea, some of the challenges that continue to persist there, and then a little bit of a comparison between the two lakes. So this image on the left is the Colorado River Basin. We've been successful recently in getting the basin boundaries, at least the maps, to show that the Salton Sea is part of that basin. And then on the right is ancient Lake Kowea. So it's a little like Lake Bonneville in that it's a historic lake. and a terminal lake. So Colorado River meandered, as rivers used to do anyway, and it would meander back and forth. So this next image, I think, highlights that a little bit better. And it's at the top of the Gulf of California, or what's sometimes called the Salton Trough. And if you can imagine the Grand Canyon or Glen Canyon, that got carved out by the Colorado River, and where did all that sediment go? Well, it's under the Salton Sea. And in fact, the Gulf of California used to extend past the Salton Sea, really to India, another 20 miles or so past the northernmost extent of the Salton Sea. But as the Grand Canyon was carved out and multiple other canyons were carved out, all that sediment got transported down the river into the delta, which is what rivers used to do, is transport sediment. And it filled it up with particularly fertile soils. And you can see in this image here that there's the Imperial Valley to the south, which is about 450,000 acres of irrigated land. And it's intensely irrigated. So we heard about alfalfa and other forage crops in Utah. They take 6 acre-feet of water per year. And you can see that right here. We just heard from Dawn about space. Well, here's an image from space. You can see the impacts of that irrigation. It's a lush region. And it used to be a lush region because the Colorado River used to have wetlands there, and Aldo Leopold wrote about the green lagoons in the region. No longer jaguars running through there, but there's a lot of water birds that continue to migrate through there. On the north end is the Coachella Valley. It's only about 75,000 acres. And then south of the border, you can see a real line there, and that's a water rights line. In south, it's about 500,000 acres of irrigated land in the Mexicali Valley. But their water right is basically half of the Imperial Valleys. So they're only applying half as much water. So that, you can see their land is much less burdened. Other takeaway from this image here is that this is a lake that's maintained by agricultural drainage. So you guys are facing challenges with agriculture diverting water, but without the agriculture, there would be no Salton Sea. It would have dried up a long time ago. I think Geoff just mentioned 1905 is when they started the diversions, or LA started the diversions from Mono Lake, or at least the tributaries. 1905 is when the current iteration of the Salton Sea formed. The Colorado River, as I mentioned, floods. And in 1905, there was a protected cut in the bank of the river, and the entire flow of the Colorado River went back into that old basin for 2.5 years and filled it up. So we often hear the Salton Sea is this accidental lake, and it's only 20 years ago or so, people were saying we should just let it dry up. But it's occurred many times over millennia, and really the birds don't care, right? The birds see water in the desert along the flyway, and California's dried up 90-95% of its wetlands, so there's not that many other places for the birds to go. Where they go along the Salton Sea, Mono Lake, Great Salt Lake. So this is an image of Red Hill Bay. Just a quick, I'm not going to talk too much about the biology of the Salton Sea here, but more than 400 different species of birds found at and around the Salton Sea. Partly it's this mosaic of agriculture and the shoreline, and there used to be a lot of fish. 25 years ago, when there was the last real biological assessment of the Salton Sea, they found more than 100 million fish, 100 million tilapia, freshwater fish, which is adapted, living in the Salton Sea. Those fish are almost entirely extirpated. But there's a lot of birds down there, including Wilson swallow reptile. So I put this together. This would be a great previous slide, but I don't really have time to dig into all this. So this is the recent history of the Salton Sea. And the takeaway here, well, I guess a couple takeaways here. One, the Imperial Irrigation District is the single largest user of Colorado River water. They have rights, or historically they had essentially an unquantified right, but to about 3.1 million acre-feet of water, right, which is historically 20% of the total flow of the Colorado River. So back in the 50s and 60s, that was the destination for the Rat Pack. Right? Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr. used to go down there with water ski. They built up these shoreline communities, and the idea was going to be Lake Tahoe South. That didn't really occur. And partly that's because the Salton Sea continued to rise. So as Imperial Valley moved to double and triple cropping, more and more water flowed through that valley and into the Salton Sea and flooded those resort communities. And then it started flooding the farmers' fields, and the farmers sued their own district, saying, complaining about a lack of reasonable and beneficial use. Went to the State Water Board, which is a state board that found a public trust doctrine for Mono Lake. Did not find a public trust doctrine, but did find unreasonable use by the district on the order of 400,000 acre feet. So Metropolitan, the single largest municipal wholesaler, serves about 19 million people from LA, or actually from Ventura all the way down to San Diego, came in and started investing. We heard a lot about water optimization yesterday. So that's exactly what happened with Salton Sea. They started investing, and they signed a transfer agreement back in 1989, moving 100,000 acre feet out of the Imperial Valley. But if you actually look at this graph, you'll note that there was a dip there partly because of a drought, but then the water use increased despite this conservation. That's because there was no baseline, right? The water right wasn't specifically quantified. There was 3 major water users in southeastern California, rights to the Colorado River, so there's no baseline to measure their conservation against. So their water use increased, and the Salton Sea continued to rise. San Diego, early 90s, was shorted because of one of the many droughts in California. They wanted to diversify their water supply portfolio, become less dependent on Metropolitan. Went out back to IID and said, hey, we like this deal that Metropolitan got. They had no mitigation requirement because they were trying to reduce the level of the lake. So there's no concern there about apply or impacts to species. So in 96, they started these negotiations, but it took 7 years, and IID really didn't want to lose the water. But at the same time, starting in 2000, the Millennium Drought hit the Colorado Basin. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But there was tremendous pressure because California at the time was using as much as 5.3 million acre feet of Colorado River water, even though normally your entitlement is 4.4. So the Secretary of the Interior said to California, reduce your use. The Governor of California said we need to get our water supply in order here. We need to reduce pressure on the Bay Delta. We need to move this water from Imperial Valley to San Diego. And the governor at the time was facing a recall election, so there was a lot of political considerations at the time. In fact, the political considerations were so great that the Salton Sea, which was a sticking point in those negotiations, the governor said, we will backstop the deal. They wrote a blank check and said that you, the water transfer parties, are only responsible for mitigation at the Salton Sea up to $133 million. Anything above that cost, the state of California will assume. Right? That was a huge check. But the governor still got recalled, and then the next administration essentially kicked the can down the road. So part of the deal was that as the state of California was going to figure out what to do with the Salton Sea, IID was going to fallow land. And they fallowed as much as 40,000 acres of land to keep salinity levels on the trajectory they would have been otherwise, while the state of California came up with a plan for the Salton Sea. But the state of California didn't come up with a plan for the Salton Sea. So that was more time than I was hoping to spend on that slide, but let's move along. So this just shows inflows to the Salton Sea, and what we saw yesterday in some of the hydrographs was that there's a tremendous variability at the Great Salt Lake. Salton Sea, there's not much variability because it's moderated by agricultural use. In fact, that water use has been higher than was initially projected at the Salton Sea. So it was about 1 million acre feet, it's starting to drop, but we were expecting it to be down to 800,000 acre feet. So it's some 200,000 acre feet higher than expected. So let's go back to the Colorado River for a second. The drought continued. 2023, we had a banner year, and elevations of Lake Mead and Lake Powell went way up. And in 2022, there was 22 straight years, essentially, of declining elevations at Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Some 35 million acre feet were lost from the system. California, because of its senior priority, did not take a drop of shortage in that time. But there was a lot of pressure on California to start reducing its use, while Arizona, which is taking as much as 600,000 acre feet of shortage, was facing all the shortage, and the system was continuing to crater. So there's pressure on California, and when there's pressure on California for water, that means there's pressure on IID. IID eventually, just a couple of years ago, agreed to kick in an additional 250,000 acre feet. So as part of the QSA, they're kicking in some 500,000 acre feet. Their use is down from 3.1 to 2.6, or even 2.5. But as part of this new deal, they're contemplating an additional 250,000 acre feet of further reductions, which means further drops to the Salton Sea. So this projection was before the additional IID contemplated reductions. So you can see that elevations continue to plummet at the Salton Sea. So it's already gone down some 11 feet since the QSA was signed, might drop another 14 feet. But if there's this 250,000 acre foot additional reduction from IID, that's gonna go even farther down. And right now, there's negotiations about the Colorado River, both for the interim period, which ends in 2026, but then post-26, we don't know what's gonna happen with the climate, but the projections are pretty grim. And if it continues to dry out, then there's less water in the system, which means there's more pressure in IID, which means less water flows to the Salton Sea. So here's just a quick image of what happens at the Salton Sea. This is already 15 years ago, or 17 years ago now. So this is Red Hill Bay, as the first image I showed you with the birds. A year later, it was dry. Right? A lot of the Salton Sea, much like the Great Salt Lake, is extremely shallow, particularly in the Salton. And what that means is, as the lake continues to shrink, more and more of this lake bed is exposed. I think there's a panel this afternoon talking about dust emissions. I think Dr. Lowe was here, I was here yesterday anyway. So UC Riverside is doing a lot of work on some of the characteristics of that dust. There's a lot of unusual characteristics of Salton Sea plant dust, which may be having particularly pernicious effects on health of the people down there. So there's two real pressures here at the Salton Sea. And the rising pressure, the rising interest is what's the impacts of public health. And this is, I think, a concern here as well as the dust flows from western deserts, but also across the playa, exposing Great Salt Lake. It impacts you guys, right? It impacts the capital, the people who live in Salt Lake City and areas down there. So 11 years in of no action from the state of California to move on restoration of the Salton Sea, even though IID had been transferring all this water in good faith to San Diego and preserving water supply reliability there. They petitioned the state water board and said, hey, if the state of California doesn't live up to its end of the agreement, why should we? Which finally got the state of California to start paying attention and start making some plans. Again, 11 years after this initial appeal was signed. Getting back a little bit to what Geoff was saying, we thought we had the rules in place. We thought that the state of California was going to act in good faith and meet its obligations, and it didn't happen until there was this water, this push to review it. So it finally actually started happening. One thing that really turned was in the beginning, 2015, they appointed the first assistant secretary for Salton Sea policy, but he had a staff of 2 or 3 people, and that staff really weren't that engaged. But just in the past couple of years, they've started to really staff up, and this chart shows there's already 35 people now. So to work on a project at that scale requires a considerable capacity. And they're finally starting to staff up to meet that. There's a lot of money in the Salton Sea. And again, there was this feeling, wow, there's all this money, and there's staffing, and there's finally political will in the Salton Sea. We should start seeing some projects get done. We've already spent more than $300 million on Salton Sea projects. The federal government recently committed as part of this new deal, this $250,000 acre additional commitment to kick in $250 million for these additional impacts at the Salton Sea. $70 million of which is already moved to the state of California from the federal government. But that's a little tricky, and I'm going to mention why in just a second. So here's the state's 10-year plan. And let's take a moment here, because this is the fundamental difference, I think, between the Great Salt Lake and Salton Sea planning. You guys have a target elevation or target range for where you want to see the Great Salt Lake. Mono Lake, there's a target elevation as well, but there's no target elevation or target salinity for the Salton Sea. What there is, as part of this 10-year plan, is a target acreage. The state, as part of the 2017 Water Board order, was committed to build 15,000 acres of habitat projects and 15,000 acres of dust suppression projects. So essentially, it's building projects around the margins, which you can see from this image. But it's essentially relegating the Salton Sea itself into a brine sump. So there's a remnant brine pool, which is largely being forgotten, ignored by the state of California. Where they're focusing on is projects around the margins. And the target is not an elevation, the target is acreage. And there are no ecological functions associated with that habitat. The target simply for the state of California is we are going to build 15,000 acres of habitat. To date, they built 163. So they are well behind schedule. But that's what the target is. And that, I think, is a fundamental difference from what we're looking at here, from the Great Salt Lake. Here's a little bit more on this one habitat project that's been constructed. This is ready to go, but because of this additional $70 million from the federal government, they're now expanding it. So on this right side by the causeway there that I showed you at the very beginning, there's roughly a 1,000-acre habitat expansion project because of the $70 million. And then the expectation is there's some additional money coming down the pipe from the federal government, so they're not going to turn the water on for this project. So to me, I'm ready to see this habitat up and running, because then the birds are immediately going to respond, but it hasn't happened yet. I'm a little frustrated. Also on the lower right here, that's the public amenity. So we also had a question about dust suppression. So the other part of this 15,000 acres of dust suppression. Probably in better news, there's some 2,700 acres of dust suppression projects built by the QSA parties. A lot of what they're doing there is this moat and row or surface roughening, and that is costing about $400 an acre. My guess is the farmers themselves are not paying anywhere near $400 an acre to plow ground, because you can't make money on if you're paying $400 an acre to plow ground. And that's what they're charging to build these dust suppression projects. The state of California, on the other hand, is doing these straw bales. We heard a little bit about this yesterday. And the state of California is paying, I'm not even going to ask for guesses, $32,000 to $38,000 an acre for this. Partly because they have to build access roads, partly because they're building some water supply infrastructure. But you can get a sense of the challenges, and this again goes back to Geoff. We think we have something in place, it's good to go, and then you find this cost escalation to build essentially a temporary dust suppression measure at a rate that's already 2 orders of magnitude higher than what local farmers are paying. One interesting unexpected consequence, and we heard a little about this from Don, was that there's a lot of emergent wetlands. Some 7,000 acres of emergent wetlands have appeared along the shoreline of the Salton Sea. These provide a lot of habitat value, and they also provide dust suppression. So essentially, every one of these agricultural drains, which used to connect to the Salton Sea, now just discharges to the shoreline, and as that water flows out on the playa, vegetation emerges. So that's been an unexpected benefit. It's been creating some endangered species issues, because there's clapper rails and pupfish in some of them, so they're trying to figure out how they're going to move through that. And then one of the challenges has been community needs. So the communities in the area are disproportionately Hispanic and poor. And they raise the important point that they've been forgotten communities. And that as a lot of this money is going into investments at the Salton Sea, they want to see their needs addressed as well. So they've been pushing for meeting some of their needs. Eventually the state of California responded with a couple of reports looking at that. They did a number of surveys, reached out, and identified some of these needs that could and should be brought on. There's still some tension there between what the state is willing to do and what the communities would like to see done, but that's moving forward. Quick challenges ahead. One is just operational. This is wet ground, and moving heavy equipment out on the wet ground means you lose a fair amount of it. I showed this a couple years ago. This is just the land ownership under the Salton Sea. It's a checkerboard, right? Your Great Salt Lake is owned by the state of Utah. Salton Sea is this massive checkerboard. Site plurality is owned by the federal government. IID owns quite a bit, but that creates real land access and easement issues and liability issues to the state of California as they're trying to build projects and also trying to piece together projects on this checkerboard. Lithium, you've all heard about lithium. Lithium at the Salton Sea is very different than lithium at Great Salt Lake because it's about 8,000 or 9,000 feet below the surface. They're not taking lithium out of the water of the Salton Sea. They're drilling way down to taking as part of the geothermal extraction. But it creates some, again, some land access issues. So the biggest single tributary of the Salton Sea is the Alamo River. That's in the known geothermal resource area. So the county and Imperial Irrigation District want to hold off on any habitat or habitat projects in that area on the right there while they're building out the geothermal lithium facilities. Upside is that there's potential some excise taxes that could go towards funding some of the Salton Sea activities, but that's years in the future. Ultimately, we don't actually know if lithium's going to be viable at a commercial scale. We put together a vision for the Salton Sea, the environmental community, and the community groups, but the state of California is not. There's no vision from the state of California as to what they want to see at the Salton Sea. When you ask them, what are you doing at the Salton Sea, they're saying, we're going to build 30,000 acres of projects. That's not the vision. And it's a challenge. So I put together this slide. I think some of the numbers on the right were based on an elevation about a week ago, so they're a little off, but just a quick comparison. I'm very envious of you guys, and your science here is so far exceeds what we have. Also, there's no Salton Sea specific group, so if we could work Friends of Great Salt Lake. Again, I mentioned we're part of the same flyway. A couple years ago, we heard about the hydro mapper. Great news is that they're starting to step one up at the Salton Sea, but it's still in the initial phases. You guys talk about imports a little bit. There's continuing talk about imports at the Salton Sea. I put together just like 10 years ago, imports. But here's invitation and flattery and all. We have a Salton Sea Summit, which is coming up. It used to be in April, but now we're pushing it back into September. It's every 2 years. Not that we're trying to be like you guys. So SaltonSeaSummit.org, I encourage you guys to, anybody who's interested, come on down. Lovely down there in October. And there'll be some tours, probably the day before, October 18th and 19th. SaltonSeaSummit.org. We'll send out some registration notices. Key lessons. I think the key lesson here is I thought we had this problem solved, and we're still finding. And the other key lesson here is the need for operations or O&M funding. We've got some capital funding. I showed you those numbers, but there's no O&M funding. So how we maintain those projects moving forward will be a consistent challenge. And one thing I want to leave you with is that we haven't heard much discussion of the factors driving climate change. Right? As we continue to pump so much greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, we're going to continue to chase a receding shoreline. Band-aids aren't going to help the pain. Because we heard a little bit, oh, the system's recovering now, things are going to be good. It's worse, and the projections are continuing to get worse. And if we ignore this problem, our problem's going to disappear. I think these recordings are saved. There's a bunch of further reading up there that you can get to. My email's up there, and I put together a Zotero library of research at the Salton Sea, so if you want to join that. Thanks.
For allowing me to be here today to talk a little bit about public attitudes and values on Great Salt Lake, and specifically the Future of Great Salt Lake survey. My name is McEntire. Just a little bit about me. I'm the managing director of the Quinney Lawson Institute for Land, Water, and Air at Utah State University. My boss is Brine, who you might know, you may have heard from yesterday. I've been able to learn from him over the past few years, really get some stronger understanding of Great Salt Lake and the policy issues surrounding it. I am also happy to be an organizer and member of the Great Salt Lake Strike Team, who you heard from yesterday as well. And I am also working on research in the Department of Environment and Society at Utah State University. I've been really grateful to work under the tutelage of Dr. Joanna Enterwada, who you'll hear from tomorrow, Dr. Karen Kettenring, who you'll also hear from tomorrow. I think I might have seen her walk in. There you are. And Dr. Lisa Welsh. I think I saw you. There you are back there. And who really did a huge amount of the legwork and heavy lifting and brain power behind the Future of Great Salt Lake survey. Why does public opinion matter? this is the group, right, that knows everything about Great Salt Lake. Why does it matter to understand what people think who may be less informed or less caring or less understanding of the issues surrounding Great Salt Lake? And I think part of that comes to some of the things and the repeated themes that I've heard over the past day and a half so far. All of us have a personal connection to Great Salt Lake. I know that Tim Hawks spent a fair amount of time dedicated to understanding Representative Snyder and Speaker Schultz's connection to the lake. And we heard and remembered about Speaker Schultz's experience in Hooper, Utah. Just barely, we heard Don talk about his experiences and his connection to Great Salt Lake. We have those, and those types of connections, those values, those frame the way that we think about management actions on Great Salt Lake. Public opinion helps set the boundaries of what is feasible policy action on Great Salt Lake. It helps us determine what are the most effective communication strategies. Even in this room, we all have a number of different frames that we use to evaluate our understanding of the value of Great Salt Lake. And if we don't understand how different people think about the lake, we can talk right past each other. If I care about Wilson's Fowler Oaks and someone else cares about recreation or brine shrimping, if we don't understand how those things are different, that can really make a challenge in being able to come together on consensus on the lake. I was thinking about my own connections on the lake. I am a Utah native. I grew up in the urban center of Salt Lake Valley. I didn't know a single farmer growing up. I could not have told you what an extractive industry was when I was in high school. But my family did like going out and recreating at Antelope Island. It was a place that we loved to go and spend time at. Actually, I was going through, some of my geotagged photos, Great Salt Lake, and I came across this really embarrassing one. I actually did my bridal photos out on Antelope Island, and it was during a wind event. And there was nothing that I could do to keep my hair down, and we just leaned into it, and I got this lovely flowy dress photo. It was a silly day, but about a year ago in June, I wanted to create that same connection with my family, and I drug them out to Great Salt Lake State Park, and it was also a wind event day. And it was cold, and that made it all the much harder to get my little kids to not be angry about the brine flies and the slimy sand, and they didn't want to get in the water because there were these weird crawly things in the water. So I shoved all my nieces and nephews, made them do the floaty picture, and like less than an hour later, we were heading back home. But while we were on the highway heading back east on I-80, these were a few pictures. I was in the driver's seat. I was in the passenger seat that I took, and these were not pictures that I remembered coming home from my bridals a lot of years ago. I won't tell you the year, but I'll tell you the elevation of the lake was above 4,200 feet. And these were, I live in Cache Valley now, and so this is something that I wasn't used to seeing. I thought it was really notable, but I didn't think a whole lot about it afterwards. I got on with my life, and then a few months later, I was working with researchers all across Utah State University, putting together the Institute's report to the governor and legislature on Utah's land, water, and air. And Randy Martin, a researcher at Utah State, he shared with me a graph that he wanted included in the report, and it was PM10 or dust levels in Salt Lake City during a dust event on June 23rd, 2023, which was the day that I was out with my family enduring Great Salt Lake. And he showed me these peaks as the windstorm and the dust traveled across Great Salt Lake Valley, and noted to me that they found elevated levels of magnesium, calcium, vanadium, and strontium in the dust samples that they were pulling from those stations. And so for me, I was building out my own stories. I'd look at graphs like this, and instead of just seeing these spiked lines, I
go back and I remember the pictures and images that I saw in my brain about the impact and the visibility of dust that we see there. So that is why the Future of Great Salt Lake survey is important. I don't think that I'm overstating it to say that it's the most extensive and rigorous look into Great Salt Lake public values and attitudes to date, as well as providing a greater understanding of what people are willing to do and support in individual actions and collective actions to save the lake. To create a rigorous and extensive study, that is quite the process. I was not on the research team for a whole lot of this, but Dr. Welsh really worked for a significant period of time in drafting this survey, in pre-testing the survey, reaching out probably to many of you in this room to get feedback on the questions and the type of information that would be useful for people to know and understand. Going back, making those revisions, administering the survey, analyzing the results, and then reporting on them. The survey itself was administered from September 2022 to January 2023, and it was actually two surveys. One was a sampled survey. It was meant to get a cross-section of residents of Utah who were in counties bordering the lake, as well as counties in the watershed, as well as a number of people who resided statewide and were not in close proximity to the lake. So those three strata were made sure to be randomly sampled from. And then there was also an open survey where anyone, probably many in this room as well, completed and filled out their attitudes and values on the lake. Just for a back of the napkin calculation, if everyone who filled this out spent 30 minutes on the survey, some spent more, some spent less. With that many responses, we're looking at something like 200 total work days of people putting in effort to provide information and context and understanding on what we know about Great Salt Lake. So my role in this project, while I'm with the Institute for Land, Water, and Air, our mission is to help connect research, high-quality research on land, water, and air at Utah State with people who need it. So I lent a little bit of our capacity and expertise to facilitating stories and publicity to expand the response rate for the survey, as well as sharing, helping to create events and other ways to share the early results of the report. And then when I joined the research team this last fall, I was able to help with the compilation of the report that's up online right now. There is a lot of data in here. This is not the focus of my presentation today, so I recommend that you go and read it. There's a QR code right here and a short code. The whole report, it's like 80 pages, is up and available online right now. I'm going to share some of my, just 2 or 3, just a taste test of some of the findings that I found most interesting in there. If you're still trying to get the QR code, I'll have it pop up again in just a second. We asked respondents what their sources of information were on Great Salt Lake. How do they build and create that knowledge and those stories about what they know about the lake? The top response was TV news, articles, other traditional media sources. My background is in print journalism, and so I was very excited to see that people are still looking to those traditional sources to do so. I think all of us would commend the efforts of the Great Salt Lake Collaborative in being able to share nuanced, in-depth, accurate stories on all of the surrounding causes of Great Salt Lake. But the second one was personal experiences and observations of Great Salt Lake. Our experiences being out and seeing the lake change the way that we view the lake. Those stories that we have, the silly and embarrassing photos, the floating photos in the lake, the going out and hunting by the lake, those things matter, and they affect what we are thinking and feeling. Even more than a year ago, the vast majority of our respondents had awareness of the challenges of Great Salt Lake, upwards of 90%. People have known, they've heard, they understand that the lake is in danger and in danger of continuing decline.
Interestingly enough, though, everyone knows that it's declining. I think that this is something that Representative Snyder referenced yesterday. Very few people understand what's actually being done to address efforts on the lake. This is legislation. I think Emily Lewis went through a bunch of this yesterday that was passed in 2022 to address challenges on declining Great Salt Lake. Down there at the bottom is House Bill 157, which was changing the way that mineral extraction royalties were managed on the lake. Fewer than 1 in 5 had heard of it or was aware of it. The one that's highest on here is the one that promoted, HB 121, that promoted water conservation by requiring all state government buildings to use water-wise landscaping. So there's a lot more in there. Go ahead and read that, but I want to talk about what's the next step of analysis with this really, really rich data set. So the report that we just went through, that was the quantitative analysis of the sampled survey. And that is, I'm not going to say it's easy, I'm sure Lisa won't say it's easy to go through and to, it's easier for respondents to be able to go through and check mark a question. It's easier to be able to tabulate it and put it into a spreadsheet and find findings. But also in the survey included those pesky, pernicious open response questions that we all love filling out because it takes time to think of your words and think how you want to respond to it. And on the flip side, it also takes a fair amount of time to go through that data and figure out what is the information that's out there and available from there. So why would we do that? There is a richness that comes from open response data. It helps us understand what are the broader values that people bring to bear when they're thinking about these close response questions. What are the thoughts that are going to outlast the issues of the day? And also, what are we missing? When we're writing up these questions, we're giving a finite amount of boxes that people are checking to be able to say their agreement on one thing or another. What are we not asking? What are people thinking that we don't, that we aren't recognizing as researchers? So we had our total responses from both surveys of more than 3,300. We just looked at those who had any written responses. There were some who just filled out the quantitative questions. And so that's still a lot of survey responses. All told, it's about 230,000 words. That's a Harry Potter book, and not Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, but Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. It's a lot to go through. We are working our way through it. We have a fair amount done, but it's gonna be my summer. Here are the questions that were asked, though, where we asked people to write out and fill a response or type it in on Qualtrics. 1, overall, how do you think your own quality of life would be affected if Great Salt Lake dried up? 2, how would your rate of satisfaction with efforts of local, city, and county officials, or how would you rate your satisfaction with efforts of local, city, and county officials in responding to the shrinking Great Salt Lake? And then the same question, but asking about the Utah legislature in the state of Utah. And then our favorite, the future of Great Salt Lake, ... And then finally, I think protecting Great Salt Lake as a public trust resource means. And so here there's a lot that we have found. I had a bunch of slides talking about the methodology process and how we're going through coding these, and I had pictures of our little coding, both hard copy and now on our spreadsheets. But there's a lot, and there's some new patterns that we're seeing, there's some that we expected, and there are some surprises. So here's just a few of them. In what terms do respondents think about Great Salt Lake? We call this framing. So what are the types of information that people privilege bring to the front of their minds when they are thinking about and talking about Great Salt Lake? I don't think it's surprising that at the top people talk about Great Salt Lake with an environmental frame. As we were going through it, we saw a split between really talking about the ecological health of the lake, about the health of bird species, and the importance of an international flyway. And then on the other side, we saw a lot of people focusing on the water itself, the impact of lake effect snow and snowpack and precipitation and the value of having water meant to them. I don't think any of us are surprised, though. I'm not sure if we tested this 6 years ago, we would have seen health and safety up at the second point. 98% of this was toxic dust. One thing that I find interesting, and that I was thinking back with my own dust story, is we don't say dust nearly as much as we say toxic dust. And I didn't see the strontium in the dust when I was driving past through that dust storm, but it's a communications piece where we have a lot more people who are thinking about what's in that particulate matter rather than just a pesky nuisance. Human well-being includes recreation and beauty and other aspects that expand quality of life due to the lake. All of these frames come from literature of other environmental issues, except for one, and it's identity and culture. This came up quite a bit. People frame the lake as an icon, as a symbol, as a cultural heritage of Utah. And I think that that's something that we as experts on the lake need to lean into. I've started doing some communications work surrounding Colorado River, and I wonder just a little bit how our care for Colorado River would change if it were called the Utah River, if we viewed it as an icon of the state. But that's an opportunity that we see in this, and it's certainly something that we see from a lot of our respondents. And then rounding that out, we've got people who view the lake in economic terms, moral terms as our duty, and a crime if we do not save the lake, as well as the lake being a point of political conflict. Okay, next, what sectors do respondents focus on for solutions? And we were looking generally at water use sectors. I personally was expecting to see agriculture just blast out everyone else, but it was really a well-rounded amount of references towards ag water use, business and industrial water use, and residential water use. And we see those. And then we also had some reference of institutional use as well as golf courses. I think that reiterates this idea that it is about all of us, that we all have a part to play, and that we all need to be a part of the solution. Next, causes respondent site for Great Salt Lake's decline. We talked a little bit asking them about solutions, but unaided, we had a lot of people in their open response questions saying, here's what we think is the problem. This is what we have to fix to be able to get to the solutions. And here are ones that we found patterns on. The first section that I'm putting together, I'm calling, we're coding as human causes. That include, at the top of the list, leadership indecision, lack of action, lack of leadership. Second, we had a lot of people making the assessment that greed and a prioritization of wealth is part of the issues that we have regarding Great Salt Lake. And then finally, ignorance and lack of understanding. The second group we're calling land and water management, and that includes both population growth and overdevelopment, as well as improper water use and management, either not having the right laws in place, not having the right usage patterns in place, and those have been viewed as causes. And then finally, people think that climate has a significant role to play in causes of the lake. There is an equal split between people who referenced human-caused climate change and natural earth cycles. This is just a drought. Earth goes through cycles, we'll get through it. And then there was another group that talked about climate cycles and changes, not human-caused, but anthropogenically modified by God or Mother Earth or someone else who had the ability to change things, but not us. We split out kind of the sectors that we asked people where we need to respond and talked about policy tools. what types of things can leaders do that you support? And we broke it out into 4 different areas. One was general policies. There were a lot of people that didn't prescribe a specific policy, but just said, please get more water to the lake. People also talked about restricting other people's ability to use water in any number of ways. Conservation was listed quite a lot, as well as other laws and policies, from lots of which are focusing on water rights and why can't we just change the whole system. Financial areas, taxes were viewed as with the highest level of mentioning, as well as water pricing, incentives, providing some type of incentive to encourage behavior, investment, general amount of a request for financial resources, infrastructure, and private donations. Information, this was one that I was really happy to see mentioned. It was one that we emphasized a little bit less in the quantitative survey. There were a lot of people who said we need to be educating people more on the lake and its value and importance. We need to be continuing to do additional study and research, planning, as well as communicating those findings and results so that we can have a broader awareness in the state on Great Salt Lake. And then finally, there was a group that asked for restraint of policy tools. Please do not tax me more. Please do not restrain my water or just generally leave the lake alone. We also paid attention to the adjectives that people used when they talked about the lake. When they're asking for action, how do they want to see leaders and other policymakers respond to the lake? And here are the ones that we saw. Viewing the lake from a protection and stewardship perspective. I grouped together the need for intensity, sacrifice, making hard decisions, doing things now. And you add those 2 up, and then in the lowest category, we had some people saying that they wanted a measured approach towards addressing Great Salt Lake. Do what we can, do things that make sense, do things that are sensible. And then in between those, a real need to have broad collective involvement in developing solutions for the lake and prioritizing it above other policy needs. Just really quickly, I know I'm running out of time, how respondents place themselves in relation to the lake. We paid a lot of attention to when people responded to the survey in the first person. And there were some parts where people said, I feel this way, my family feels this way. And that was most highly in the how I would be impacted if the lake were to decline. But there was also a little bit of I'm trying to do my part, or the lake is important to me because. And then there was a higher version of we. I think that's part language, but it's also part how people really view about the need for collective action on the lake. We will be in trouble if we don't save the lake. We have a responsibility to save it. It's in our hands. I think we've heard that a couple times already in the symposium over the past few days. And finally, we are recipients of benefits. The last thing that I wanted to share of what we're looking at are patterns that we found that we weren't specifically looking for, where we had enough people saying something the same that that may cause us to change our relationship with water, change the way that we think about water. A lot of people, unaided, said that the future of Great Salt Lake is really tied to the future of Utah, that those two are linked and that they're connected. And if we see a decline in the lake, we're going to see a decline in what we see happening broadly in the state. A lot of people really viewed Great Salt Lake as a generational legacy. They were thinking about it not as just a resource for their own lifetimes, but a resource that they want to be able to make sure that their children and grandchildren and others in the state are able to benefit from and enjoy. I was not expecting this. I don't think any of us who were coding were expecting the number of people who said, if toxic dust becomes a problem in the state, if we see a continued decline in the lake, I will move. I will leave the state. I will find somewhere else. And I think we understand that just a little bit about how so many people, especially recent move-ins to Utah, have moved here because of the access that we have to beautiful environmental resources. And to lose that becomes a critical factor in quality of life, in health and safety, in all those great US News rankings that Utah gets as being the best state in the nation. A number of people really connected and said we need to understand Great Salt Lake as one of those critical effects of climate change. That was just barely brought up and by Michael, and that was a pattern that we saw. And then finally, something that really was interesting was we need to change our relationship with the land and how we think about the land, and really embracing the fact that Utah is an arid state. We live in a desert, and sometimes we need to act that way. So I'll just close really briefly by saying, this is public opinion, but it matters. The words that we use matter. I know that Emily Lewis yesterday, she talked about how the difference between talking about saved water and conserved water, and how just changing the words that we use, talking about toxic dust versus just dust, changes the pictures that we build in our head. Language matters. Attitudes, and I know I spelled it wrong, it was really late last night, matter. Attitudes and values matter. These are the types of things that the more that we know about, the more effective we can be in whatever piece or value of the lake that we have. Just lastly, this is not research. This next part has nothing to do with research, but I felt bad that when we're talking about all of these pictures that we build in our head, I gave you a whole lot of graphs and data. And I was trying to think, how do I bring it back to pictures that we have? What I did, I took some of the most descriptive, flowery language from some of our key survey responses, and I tossed it into an AI image generator. I put a lot of just straight up responses in there, and they said, well, yes, I can tell that you're talking about agriculture, but what do you want? And so I had to do a little bit of manipulation of saying I want a picture of, but just really quickly, what's a picture of agriculture? We had word descriptors that we received of overpumped, unsustainable, sold to China, golden cows, inefficient, water-intensive crops, all about money, big ag. And so here's what, oh, it gets better. They gave me 3. I don't know why his face is gold, but I like that he's pumping the money. I don't know what happened there, but it just kept picking up on something, which is why AI is so great. This is not research. What's a picture of politicians? There was a mention of inflated government. And so there are a number of descriptors in there. I know I'm out of time. This is not from the survey, but I just added some foul ropes dancing. What's a picture of growth? We had status quo of beautiful green lawns and flood irrigation in a desert, the insanity of HOAs, water wasted on lawns, parks, golf courses, cemeteries, and other uses. So this was not real, but I think we see little pieces of this. I asked them to put a person in this, and then we got this guy. I don't know where the hose is coming from, but he has a little HOA badge on there. I don't know if you can see that. What is a picture of developers? Developers will pay off those in charge and keep consuming all the water they need for their projects. We need to sustain growth. Real estate developers have run roughshod over the landscape of Utah. So again, I asked them to add a person. Here's a real estate developer. Just so you know, AI gave me no women.
ever, unless I specifically asked for them. But they did take his head away. I don't know why. But I also put in some of our pictures of success, and I will end on this. We know that these aren't real. We know that they're a little bit silly, but the pictures that we have in our head matter. And I think we need to spend some time understanding the nuance of what other people are thinking and what we ourselves are doing. We talked about stunning natural beauty, restoring to its former glory, stewardship for generations to come, thriving, clean water, wildlife, full of water that will help keep our lake effect snow coming in winter, ski industry, a number of these. And so that's not Salt Lake City, but it looks a little bit like a dowdle puzzle. But I think that there are elements of this. Laura talked a little bit yesterday about what does a healthy Great Salt Lake Basin look like. And there are some of those pictures. Thank you. I know I'm over time.
Stuff